And sort of this governance transition team has been formed with members from Hamilton and Marion County. Appreciate everybody's time in serving. And I'll turn it over to Brad to sort of review our charge and to go into our agenda. And we'll try to make it as participative as we can, but we want to try to level set everybody with the same information in this meeting today, and then we'll review what our next steps are at the end. So Brad, you want to take over? Or Matt, do you have anything you want to say?
No, well said, and thank you for allowing me to participate, and look forward to today's meeting and keeping things moving forward. So thank you, and we'll get going.
Brad?
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Matt. I have muted all of you just so we don't get feedback. So when you want to talk, you are free to unmute yourself. But here's our agenda for today. And so we're going to do introductions here real quick in a second. We'll turn it over to Matt Carter and Brenda Myers, and Emily Mack, if she's able to join us to talk about some big picture, kind of set the stage. Then you'll hear for a while from me. This will be the only meeting like this, but I'm going to give everyone a brief overview of the White River Vision Plan just to set the stage, everyone on the same playing field. Then we'll do some deep diving into what governance is, what we've done so far, and then we'll end the meeting with some Q&A discussion, and then with what's next, kind of next in the timeline. All right, so let's do brief introductions. Do you want to state your name and kind of what you do in your day job, and to reduce awkwardnesses, let's just go down the list of you see on the screen there. So we'll start with Matt.
I am the Chief Financial Officer at Becknell Industrial and live in Hamilton County.
You're next.
Okay. I think we're all maybe a different order on
Okay.
everybody's different screens in different order, so that may not be as user-friendly as we'd hope. I'm next. So I'm Tom Dickey. I work for the Hageman Group, which the first clarifying thing is it's not Hagerman. I don't work for the construction company, the Hageman Group. The Hageman Group is a family office. I work for the Hageman family. I'm responsible for looking for good investments in commercial real estate for the Hageman family. In that context, we're invested in projects throughout Indiana and the Midwest. And in a prior life, I was a developer and attorney with Duke Realty, and worked for 3 years with the mayor and Fishers on downtown redevelopment. Spent a lot of time with Brenda as chair of the Hamilton County Economic Development Corporation.
All right, Betsy.
I'm Betsy McCaw. I am Executive Vice President at the Heritage Group, responsible for people, and I have the pleasure of serving as Vice Chair of Tourism Tomorrow with Matt and Brad. And I also had the, I think, hopefully benefit and privilege of being able to participate in the work that led to this last year. So pretty passionate about what this can do for our region, and I'm really excited to be here and part of this group to help figure out what the future can look like in terms of governance.
All right, Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Valou Thompson, and I'm an integrative health specialist. And for my Hamilton County Leadership Project in 2008, I drew out this White River Pathway. And I'm so happy that here we are. But yeah, super excited. You guys have done, this is an incredible amount of work. I'm looking at the report and everything. It's absolutely fabulous. So happy to be part of this creative group. Thank you.
All right.
Great. Next, I'm Sam Odle, representing the Marion County delegation, and I'm a retired healthcare executive, retired from IU Health, and now do consulting through the Bose Public Affairs Group.
Great. And I'm Emily Kruger. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of 16 Tech Community Corporation, and we're responsible for developing the 16 Tech Innovation District, which is on the northwest side of downtown where the White River and Fall Creek meet. So I'm very excited to be a part of this because activating that riverfront is something that we're really excited about for the tenants and visitors in the district.
All right, Councilor Osley, you're next.
Yeah, Bob Osley, City County Councilor. I serve as president of the council. The river actually runs through my district. I have the distinct honor of having been a classmate, an SKO classmate with Tom Dickey, and I think that will be my highlight for this introduction.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, and while we're on the topic of SKL classmates, Emily Kruger and I are SKL classmates, and Sam Odell was our moderator, and so SKL 38. All right, Brian.
Hi, this is Brian Payne, President and CEO of the Central Indiana Community Foundation. One of our community leadership initiatives that we've been really proud of over the years has been, we were co-founders of Reconnecting to Our Waterways along with the Eli Lilly and Company Foundation. We did that together in 2011. It's still going strong, and we still are a funder, and in fact, one of my staff members is the co-chair of the board at this point. So and that's Alphonse Van Adricum. So still very involved in that and very thrilled to be part of this.
All right, and I don't see Amy Conrad Warner on.
We skipped over Aaron. I see he's on, but not.
Aaron, sorry, we missed you.
Yeah, no, you're totally fine. Yeah, I am in Noblesville. I'm on city council here. I own my own business that works with organizations that are looking for communications needs. So I'm kind of all over the central Indiana area with that. And the river also runs through my district as well, downtown Noblesville. So this is something that I've had multiple conversations with Brenda about, and I am super excited to be here.
Thank you.
All right, great to have you. I expect to see Amy Conrad Warner, but for those of you who don't know Amy, she's the Vice Chancellor for Community Engagement, I think is her title, or Community Affairs for IUPUI. Then turning over to staff, again, I'm Brad Bobian. I am currently the Director of Destination Development for Visit Indy. Prior to last fall, I was the Administrator for Long Range Planning for the City of Indianapolis, where I was really the lead planner behind this plan. Sarah?
Looks like I'm next. I am Sarah Buckner, and I am currently the Destination Development Manager for Hamilton County Tourism.
Hi, and I'm Matt Carter. I'm with Visit Indy and am the Vice President of Destination Development.
I'm Carmen Lethig. I took over Brad's position, the City of Indianapolis Administrator of Long Range Planning at DMD, and excited to be here. Thank you.
Does not look like Director Mack has been able to join us. So Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Miller. I'm Long Range Planner for the Department of Metropolitan Development with the City of Indianapolis.
And last but not least, Brenda.
And I'm mad because I meant to get a White River picture and put it behind me. Because I learned that you could do that, and I thought that was really cool. I'm Brenda Myers, and I'm president of Hamilton County Tourism.
All right, and it looks like Amy's been able to join us. I introduced you briefly, Amy, but you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Brad. I'm just glad to be here, and sorry I was on another call. Look forward to it. I'm with IUPUI, Vice Chancellor for Community Engagement.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to put you all back on mute, but if you want to ask a question or anything, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. And so now, next, we are going to go to the big picture. And for this, we're going to have Matt Carter from Visit Indy, as well as Brenda from Hamilton County Tourism, kind of open up with what this means for our region.
Yeah, so I'll say for a couple of seconds, and then Brenda, I'm going to turn it to you. When many of us had the opportunity to be on the team, VOP, you were there, and several others were as well, in terms of this opportunity of knitting together a resource that had been ignored for a long, long time, that brought all types of populations together in the region in a way that was both extraordinary and timely, and that as a result of the Citizens Energy Big Dig project, that we, for the first time, we're going to be presented with an opportunity to develop a resource in a new way that had been damaged historically and this opportunity to be preserved for a future in an extraordinary way that had some varying elements to it. Brian Payne knows that as CEOs for cities and now Forward Cities, we had studied river and water at every city we were moving to, whether it was on the agenda or not. And a large part of that was out of the CEOs for Cities Livability Challenge that the Reconnecting Our Waterways effort was lifted up and started. And that's gained some momentum from those who clearly have an environmental bent and have been there forever. But it was gaining momentum from others that saw the opportunity. What we learned in places like Des Moines and Pittsburgh and other places were that planning did not get in front of those progress programs, and that they had regrets. And so as a city and a region and a state, we were presented an opportunity to engage those who plan and understand the long windows of planning, that getting in front of this would at least bring the communities together around an alignment of what they wanted to see. And so what we're faced with today, which seems awkward timing in the presence of the current shock that our society is going through, is that what planners inherently know is that these moments are also great opportunities to plan for the future, because they are used to planning well beyond a week or a month or a year, but in terms of decades. And so what we are presented with and what you as a task force really have the opportunity to do is to create perhaps the most transformative project that our state has seen. And that may not be self-evident today, but I think you will find that as we dive deep into this, that this has a transformative opportunity that brings all the diversity of our state together in every conceivable subcategory that you want to discuss, while simultaneously knitting us together around a lot of the difficult challenges that we've faced historically. So one of the things that Brad's going to get into the detail as we walk through, and Brenda's going to talk more specifically into some of those elements, is that the timing of this and is in its critical nature is that most all of the guiding principles have assets around them that can represent them strongly. The one that doesn't is equity. And so the equity piece, when you don't have the policies nor the groups in place to be able to address that, we felt that the importance of getting the plan in front of this, having those discussions now, and declaring those issues early on was as good a buffer while the public and the policy leaders have those debates, but to give them a context in which it could be applied so that this truly does become a resource for everyone. Brenda?
Some of you may or may not know that we funded a study of, just to try to move things forward while we were working through this transition period, a study of it's basically 116th Street to 146th Street on River Road, to take 3 parks that total 1,000 acres and put them into a parks district, including a river education center. And we had those meetings last week in the middle of all of this chaos, as Matt mentioned. I tried to not have those meetings last week, but we really needed to have those meetings. And it was the glimmer of hope last week for me. It was unbelievable to see how we could take these 3 parks and transform them into something meaningful. And that would never have happened without this plan. And so I think we're already seeing the amount of impact that we can have, not only cross-county, but within our own communities, and the conversations that we're having that we would have never had had we didn't, governance aside, just the idea that we are now coming around this important resource, as Matt said, and trying to gather our thoughts on what makes sense for the future. So I'm really excited about this today. I love the process that Matt and Brad and Betsy have come up with to propose to the team. I think it's thoughtful and insightful. It really draws on the expertise of those people, like Brian had mentioned, have been out in the field forever, Roe and White River Alliance and Friends of the White River. It draws on some of those expertise to come in and help us and guide us. So I think while we don't really have the map, we are getting ready to this is what the map is all about, and you all are going to help us do that. And I think it's going to be transformative. And Matt said it, now's the time to do it. It doesn't feel like the time to do it, but now's the time to do it because people are going to need this more than ever. So thank you. Thanks for all your work on this. We appreciate you all being on the team. Excited about this group.
All right, thank you, Matt and Brenda. So now I know some of you were intimately involved in the White River Vision Plan, and some of you were shocked when you got an email that either Brenda or the mayor's office nominated you. So we thought we'd give you all kind of a level playing field. You should all have received in the mail. I'm not sure about you, Julie, since you were not on the initial mailing list, but you should all have received a print copy of the plan, executive summary, a print copy of the task force report. Julie, do you have that? I know I got it to you by email, but.
I have one in my car, Julie, that I can run to your house. Sorry.
I think I have it. I have this.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so everyone should have everything. So I'm going to give you a brief kind of overview just to give everyone the same kind of playing field. So Indianapolis was really ahead of the game back when we developed White River State Park downtown, but in the meantime, cities across the nation, including many of our competitive regions, have really caught up with us. And so these are just a few of the cities that we really compete with for residents and for talent, for business, and some of the things that they've started to do for their riverfront. But we shouldn't just look at what our peers are doing. We need to be inspired really about what's happening across the world. And so these are just some of what some global cities are doing. Singapore built Gardens by the Bay. That's now the largest, biggest attraction in entire Southeast Asia. And that's a riverfront kind of nature park. Seoul tore down an urban freeway. And you can see what they did there. They really naturalized it, and now it's became kind of this massive gathering spot. Some of the biggest real estate values in the city are now developed along there. What you see there in Shanghai is for their Huangpu River along the, try to pronounce this, Lejuajiahui district, which is the financial district. That's the skyscrapers that literally appeared over a decade. And so they're now knitting all that together with this riverfront district to make it more livable. And Paris, of course, is a flat city without mountains, without oceans, just like us, that has a river running through it. And so their river is a working river and has its own pollution issues, but every summer they truck in sand and put it there on the beach. You can see how popular that's become for their residents. Now, have any of you been to any one of these cities or have another city riverfront that you kind of want to lift up as something that we should be inspired by?
Did you have Nashville on there? I can't remember.
Yeah, Nashville.
Yeah, this is Brian Payne.
Yeah, that is right. Cumberland, yeah. And then in Minneapolis, Sarah went to the one in Minneapolis, the riverfront development in Minneapolis.
Okay.
Greenville, South Carolina.
Greenville. Oh, sorry. We went to Greenville this time. That's beautiful.
Right, Brian. That was wonderful.
Uh-huh.
And we just had the mayor of Greenville here a week or two ago. Yeah.
The chamber took its Lex trip last fall to San Antonio, which I think is another great city for looking to reference.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's, a lot of people reference that. And the thing about that Riverwalk is that was actually a flood control project, right? And so they took something that was normally quite ugly with a piece of infrastructure to deal with floods and turned it into this amazing world-renowned community asset.
I haven't myself seen it, but I read a book by the former mayor of Oklahoma City, and it sounds like they've done a lot of cool stuff down in their downtown area as well.
Yeah, Oklahoma's done some cool things. Oklahoma City and also Tulsa just unveiled a massive riverfront park for investment. So, yeah, we're not the first ones to think about this, and as I'll mention I'll talk about that later, that actually benefits us. All right, so the White River Vision Plan is a plan for all 58 miles of river in both Marion and Hamilton counties. It is one of the largest planning efforts underway in the nation right now. And this is actually a point of distinction from all of those places that we just looked at, which are mainly focused on signature, large downtown parks. We might be talking about that, but we're also talking about a 58-mile experience of destinations big and small, developed as well as wild. Now, the planning team initially was convened by the City of Indianapolis, specifically the Department of Metropolitan Development, Hamilton County Tourism, Inc., and Visit Indy and our nonprofit arm, Tourism Tomorrow. We had several citizen committees. Some of you were members of those. So we had a steering committee that balanced some regional interests. We had a stakeholder committee that was more individual or kind of advocacy interests, so things like parks departments and anchor destinations like Conner Prairie, large landowners, environmental groups, things like that. And then we also had 6 technical task force groups, which really provided the bulk of the depth, the bench of local expertise. Our lead consultant was a group called Agency Landscape and Planning. They were based out of Boston. The lead of that firm was actually involved in the original planning of the current White River State Park back when she was with Sasaki, when they were the planners for that. And so there was a host of both local and national experts. We had a local kind of engagement team that helped us, and we had both local and national technical experts that helped cover the breadth of what we were talking about. And we went through a little over a year planning process, started in spring of 2018 with a discovery phase, and that's really the existing conditions, getting down everyone's plans that they already had, research the river in and out so we know what's going on with the river, look at climate change projections coming out of Purdue and all sorts of things like that. That led into the envision phase, which was the fun phase, because that's what we got to talk with the community about. What's next? What do you want to see? When this river is cleaned up, how does that transform how you view it? And then that led into the action phase, and so that's putting the plan together, working on the initial governance and implementation work, which I'll talk about in the next set of presentations, as well as finalizing the plan. Now, over that year, we held community conversations to engage lots of people. We heard from more than 13,000 voices. We did host our own meetings, but most of our engagement was actually joining existing events where people were already gathering, were already meeting. Me and specifically Brenda had conversations over dinner in people's kitchens, but we also had meetings in corporate boardrooms. These are just some of the groups, some of the voices that we heard from. They represent rural, suburban, urban voices, parks and public works departments, anchor destinations, as well as environmentalists. And from all of these conversations emerged this vision. The White River is Central Indiana's next frontier, unifying and diverse, productive and protected, timeless and contemporary. The river sets us apart as communities that can work together to realize big dreams. Its healing power guides us toward a resilient future, supports healthy neighborhoods and economies, honors the past, and improves the lives of Hoosiers for generations to come. Now, the timeline for this plan is generational. It's a generational plan to connect literally thousands of existing and new parks and destinations to create a national park scale amenity in the heart of our region. Because it is generational, it won't happen overnight. It will outlive every political cycle, and there'll be a lot of change that happens over those years. And so the plan is not a master plan for 58 miles. Instead, it's organized around 2 frameworks, and the first of those are guiding principles. I'll come back to these and kind of do a deep dive in each of these here in a minute, but they're loosely grouped into these categories of environmental principles, activation and community principles, and then equity and economy principles. The other framework we use are river reaches or character zones that celebrate the diversity of landscape and communities that we have along those 58 miles. So within each of those reaches are anchors or case studies that represent the diversity of the places that we do have. And so for each of those, we've done a deep dive to explore those areas with the idea that they provide lessons for all of those places, big and small, in between. And so when you think of those 2 frameworks as a matrix, with each case study illustrating the application of those principles and then each set of principles being illustrated a variety of ways in different places across the region. So on to those principles. The first and probably most foundational group of principles relates to environment and ecology. We know that our regional climate is changing, and according to Purdue scientists, that's going to mean increased highs and lows in the river, including increased intense storms and more destructive flooding. And so how do we think about the future of the river with that in mind? Now, our first principle along those lines is about addressing that climate change through two different actions: managing and storing water on a regional scale before it gets into populated neighborhoods, and also the idea of a free-flowing river. And so when we talk about stormwater, today we have about 6,500 buildings in both of our counties that are in the floodplain in our study area. So that study area is a half-mile buffer around both sides of the river. So there's 6,500 buildings today, and we know that flooding is only going to get worse. Now, once development happens in these areas, it's incredibly expensive to protect. We have to build and maintain levees and flood walls and pumping stations and things like that. And so while those options might be the only option for places that are already built, we can strengthen zoning regulations and improve what gets built. And so for those places that are already built, it's significantly more cost-effective to store water in unpopulated areas than to continue to build levees and walls around our communities. And so we can protect upstream rural lands from development by purchasing flooding easements from farmers and existing quarries and direct floodwaters to those areas instead of into our neighborhoods. So store floodwaters before they cause harm, while compensating those landowners and protecting their land and maintaining its character. The second piece of that, restoring and adapting, is about the free-flowing river. Now, today there are 6 dams on the river, and they are all currently necessary to serve either water supply or for utilities. Now, all of those dams are low-head dams, although one recently failed and another's modified a little bit. But if you don't know, low-head dams are incredibly dangerous for people. Low-head dams are essentially single walls across the river, and when water flows over them, it creates this very dangerous current that traps and drowns people. So they're very dangerous for humans, but they're also very bad ecologically. They don't allow fish and mussels, which are a critical species for improving water quality. It doesn't allow those to move up and down the river and migrate. So the good news, though, is that we can retrofit those dams into things called rock arch dams or rock rapids, which are basically a series of cascading rapids that maintain the upstream pool that we need, but does it in a way that's safe for people and allows fish and mussels to migrate. And so there at the top, those pictures are examples of dams that don't look like dams as we think about them. Now, the second principle under environment has to do with protecting and preserving the natural spaces that we have. Now, at the bookends of our study area, we have 2 amazing parks that are big enough to have what ecologists refer to as core habitat, which are interior forests where you start seeing special species that you won't find anywhere else. So up in northern Hamilton County, we have Strawtown-Petaway Park, and in Marion County, the southern border, we have Southwestway Park. And these are both critically important ecological places that we have to preserve, if not enlarge, and do a better job connecting. And then the final principle around environment starts connecting humans into the environmental story by exposing them to the full seasonality of the river. The river has very different personalities throughout the season, and the same location can have dramatically different reasons for people to come learn about the river over the year. And so those old quarries that we typically turn into lakefront mansions eventually, we have different views on how those can bring entirely new experiences to all of us. And similarly, we have dug quarries. We don't have mountains, but we've kind of got reverse mountains that we've dug into the earth around the mountain. And so let's capture those unique landscapes. In the spring, we can flood them, as I noted, but in the summer, they can be performance venues, symphony in the forest. In the fall, they can be active ropes courses and zip lines and rock climbing. And in the winter, they can be the most unique ice skating experience in the Midwest. And so what does that look like on the ground? And so I mentioned 2 parks. And so Southwestway Park is in southern Marion County. Parts of it are beautiful, but parts of it look like this today, kind of really loved by the neighborhood, by the community. Here's how we can apply those principles of protecting that core habitat in the background while also adding new amenities like camping and like a boardwalk and canoe and kayak launch for residents to enjoy. Restoring some of the grasslands and the wetlands and the prairies that were there is also having some educational art or signage to talk about the history, both social and natural. And then up north, we have Strawtown-Katewa Park in northern Hamilton County. And it is a quite beautiful experience today, but how can we improve that? We can continue working on some of the invasive removals that line many of our waterways. We can restore some of the native woodlands and wetlands and grasslands to improve water quality and capture that storm water. And we can add things like public art and new experiences so we can provide people year-round destinations to experience the changing landscape. So that's the first group of principles around environment. The next group really focus on the people side of things and how we can activate the river and make it a part of the daily quality of life of our residents. Now, most of the land along the river is not publicly owned, and we'll come back to that. So we really have to focus on preserving the land that we do have in public ownership, promote the purchase or easement of more, but we know that in some places it's not going to be continuous public access. And so we have to think about how places like the rights-of-way, the bridges, the roads that terminate at the river, how those become places where we can pull the river, we can access the river and connect it into our neighborhoods. There's also the storytelling aspect of this. And so, both Noblesville and Indianapolis are here because of the river. And there were communities here because of the river well before, the European settlers arrived. And so there's a whole lot of stories that we can tell about our people and about our place and how it's changing and evolving using the river. Think about it as a 58-mile museum of natural history as well as social history. And then think big picture about our region and how we compete for people, how we compete for businesses, how we compete for talent, how we retain people here in our community. We don't have mountains, we don't have oceans, but we can have a national park in our backyard that people can do amazing things. And so how does that land on the ground? It lands on the ground in places like Noblesville, which has done a lot of work in the past decade or so, focusing on the river. Now, Brenda hates this picture. Former Mayor Ditzler hated me using this picture. In full disclosure, this photo was taken when the bridge, was under construction. So it doesn't always look like this, but throughout our region, we have pockets of development right along the river. Oftentimes there's leftover parking lots, just slivers of land tied to infrastructure projects. We have places like this all over the region. And it's really places like these that are already developed where it makes sense to fulfill the demand for waterfront living and working and dining. Rather than take an undisturbed area, a natural area, let's keep it compact in the villages like Noblesville that are already there. And let's add new amenities. Here we show a boardwalk with a natively landscaped terrace that filters water and provides smaller scale performance spaces for our community. And then there's places like Keystone at the Crossing, which is probably our poster child in the region for how we've turned our back on the river. And if you knew the river flowed through this area, it's only because you've been stuck in traffic on this bridge here on 82nd Street. But this is where we put billboards and dumpsters and employee parking lots right up against and along the river. So over time, let's flip the development so it embraces the water. Let's turn those dumpster areas into restored wetlands and prairies, fronted with waterfront dining and shopping and recreational experiences. And if you look closely, let's import tropical birds. I'm actually kidding there. But let's restore the wetland. Let's provide new experiences, new shopping destinations that are unlike anything else you can experience really in the Midwest. And then further down the river, we have Broad Ripple, which historically has primarily embraced the canal, but has more recently started turning its attention with developments to the river. And so new multifamily, new mixed-use buildings are popping up here. What you're looking at here right now is actually the intake from the White River kind of on the right and the canal to the left. This is where the water comes in to feed Indianapolis, to supply Indianapolis. It's incredibly critical and sensitive piece of infrastructure, but we can enhance its banks. We can line it with those waterfront living and dining options, unite the canal experience that exists today that we're gradually working on with the new river experience, bring them together into one amazing experience. So we've covered principles about environment, we've covered principles about activation. We're going to end with principles addressing equity. So we know that Central Indiana will continue to absorb more and more of the state's growth, and that's going to put pressure on existing land uses as well as on existing neighborhoods. Now, in both of our counties, historically, the most marginalized in our communities have been pushed to the river's edge because of its hazards. We also know that growing population pressures coupled with investments like what we're talking about in parks and amenities that makes places more desirable to live can have negative consequences for some of our most vulnerable residents. As Matt alluded to at the beginning, we've also heard lessons from Pittsburgh, who lost large swaths of public riverfront access because they were focused on getting private development going. We've also heard from Greenville, who's had to figure out how to build affordable housing to keep neighbors in their communities after the fact, after the land prices had already skyrocketed. So if there is a bright side to coming to this game late, it's that we can actually understand and know that this will too happen in our communities, and we need to get in front of it. And that also means not just thinking about parks and trails and greenways and amenities, but also other community issues that will be impacted, like affordable housing and economic opportunity and community identity. And I mentioned that most of the waterfront today is not publicly owned. And so that means that we've got different ways we have to approach the river. There are places where we do have public access. There are places where we don't, but we might be able to acquire easements to provide that public access on private property. And then there are places where we will not be able to do that. And the connection points, the access points become the bridges that our communities have. And so how do we think about infrastructure as ways to provide access while respecting the different ownership and land use patterns throughout the region? I will say one of the most interesting and perhaps rewarding pieces of this process was when we had this realization that rural farmers, landowners in northern Hamilton County that had been farming for generations there were fearful of losing their property to projects like this. And people living in the core of Indianapolis in disadvantaged, marginalized communities that had also lived there for generations had the same fear. And so the fact that we brought both of them into the table, we brought all of those populations into our committee and to hear from them. And so this is coming from a very heartfelt, diverse part of our community. And then the final principle is this screenshot of this Brady Bunch board of people from both counties working across county lines, across all sorts of boundaries, literal and figurative, to figure out how we can continue to make this happen, continue to make this something very special for our people and for our region. So our last illustration of what that looks like on the ground is looking at downtown Indianapolis. And when we talk about downtown, we're talking about everything from the GM stamping plant all the way really up to 38th Street, where Riverside Park terminates. So it's not just the core of downtown, it also includes some of the core neighborhoods. This is one of our dams that most recently failed. That's causing a lot of consternation in the community about what its future will be like. But we know that some way, somehow, this needs to be restored because this provides the pool of water for Indianapolis's emergency water intake. This is a historic dam that was built about a century ago. It's also got a social history. South of this dam, immediately south of this dam, was what was known as Belmont Beach. And so in the 1920s in Indianapolis, like in most cities, our public swimming pools and our public parks were segregated. Our Black neighbors were not allowed to participate in those amenities. And so this was the only part of the river where the power structure allowed basically water recreation for our Black neighbors. And why was it allowed there by the powers that be? It was the most polluted piece of the river. It's a place that they didn't care about. So that's an incredibly powerful story, and we want to resurrect that story. Not that we want to celebrate it, but we want to never forget that it happened. We want to connect the resilience of the river that has survived and thrived despite of all the things that people have done to it, as well as the resilience of the communities that are along it that have thrived despite everything that they've been put through. And so this is kind of a signature downtown park type of amenity that tells a very important, critical, inclusive social story. All right, so I'm going to put all of you on unmute again and ask you a question. Does anyone have any thoughts on which of these principles from your perspectives is probably going to be the hardest to achieve?
Brad, if I may, this is Bob.
Yes.
The last point that you made is probably going to be one of the toughest to achieve with the failure of the Emmericksville Dam. And for it to occur in this very sensitive spot along the river, sensitive in the social aspect, with the history of segregation that you mentioned, I think that it is an incredibly sensitive component for this vision plan to address, because it had been for years segregated. There's a lot of memory, a lot of historic memory that goes with this location along the river. And how we address it and how we work with trying to create something that is comparable to what has been, that still brings the same amount of joy and, I would say, pride in all of this, that will encourage a community that historically had been excluded to participate in this and to be a proud partner in all of this, is going to be that thing that you just mentioned right now, and that is difficult to achieve. But it's got to be addressed, and I hope that the solution that we can come up with will move us to that point. It is so incredibly unfortunate that of the 7 dams I think that we have in this stretch, that this would be the one that would fail. And I think that there is a lot of, I think that folks are looking at what we do to be a marker and to gauge the esteem with which we hold that community.
All right, agreed. Thank you, Councilor Osley. Does anyone have other thoughts about which ones might be more difficult?
Can I just add, I agree with you, Councilor. I think it's not going to be most difficult in Hamilton County to honor ownership. In the farm areas, it's going to be difficult to persuade people that they can trust us that we're going to honor ownership. Does that make sense? I mean, it's going to take a long time. And we have a neighborhood called Riverwood that is extraordinarily worried about development. I don't think I think the most difficult one for us, and Aaron, you can chime in here, and Tom is partner across boundaries. Our cities get along in Hamilton County, but sometimes they have different perspectives, would you not say? Mm-hmm. And so trying to get 3 municipalities and a county alone in Hamilton County, quite frankly, to get along, and then we add, and then across 96th Street, I'm just acknowledging the elephant in the room that it's not going to be the easiest thing. I think we can do it. It's just not going to be the easiest thing. And I would love your opinion, Tom and Aaron.
Yeah, this is Aaron. I definitely agree. We as I've talked to people in Noblesville and then across city lines too, I've always said that far too often we make decisions as if the world ends at 146th Street, and that's just not the case. And so I think that that idea of partnering across boundaries and explaining how this is a regional effort. I know that R word is a tough word for a lot of people to jump onto, but how it's necessary. And I think that's going to be the biggest part for us. I would agree with what you said, Brenda.
Yeah, and this is Tom. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to that other than just from experience, having worked as chair of the Hamilton County Economic Development Corporation, to build consensus among leadership can be hard and can be really, really hard, and can also be easy at times. And when it's easy, it's when there's a compelling vision and the leadership gets behind it. And so I think that's why this next step of this plan is so critically important, that the vision, the compelling vision that we've seen in summary today and that you guys have worked on for over a year, needs to get to the leadership as quickly as possible, and not in detail, but just it needs to be part of the cocktail conversation that this is a good thing, and then continue to get more and more detail to leadership in those cities and in the county. And then it can be easy. And so I think that I just make that point mainly to make the point that this part of the this transition, the governance transition team has a really important job ahead of it in that regard.
Right, that lines up with staff's thought. I mean, if you think about environment, we may not have the most stringent environmental regulations in the nation, but we have them, right? We have a DNR, we have an IDIM. When you think about activation, we already have counter prairie and new fields and park systems in all of our communities. And so we already have developers who build buildings and things like that. Equity, there's not a lot of tools and protection around. There's not a lot of good history in our region of regionalism. We don't have a lot of tools to preserve affordable housing and keep people in their homes, and things like that. And so that's, staff kind of has agreed that that's probably the most vulnerable of all of these sets of principles. All right, I'll put you all back on mute.
Hey, Brad.
Brad.
Yes.
Brad, this is Sam. I would just, because I'm not nearly as adept or knowledgeable as some of you who've been working on this for a long time, is that how would you articulate the compelling reason to look at this 58-mile stretch? You know, why is it this 58-mile stretch versus 75 miles, or, you know, going further, or narrowing down to, 20 miles,
And that's a very good question. That's something that we talked about early on. And for those of you who don't know, there is a White River Caucus in the State House. It's a bipartisan in both houses. And obviously, they're interested in more than just our 58 miles. And so we believe that this has an opportunity to grow upstream and downstream. Delaware County is actually, they've removed 2 or 3 wellhead dams right now as part of some regional cities grant work that they've done. So they've done some amazing stuff. Anderson is still figuring out the reservoir versus kind of alternative experience. Downstream, there's not a lot of larger communities along it, but still there could be ways to participate. And so We view this 58 miles as a starting point. It's, the two, Central Indiana is the population center of the entire state, and this idea that we can have this national park. And when you think about that idea, also I encourage you to think about the tributaries. So all of those smaller creeks and streams that flow out to communities that may not have riverfront. But how do we think about that? And so this idea of this national park that extends its fingers throughout our entire region, to me, is the compelling reason about why we start here.
Yeah.
Brenda, you were going to say something? Nope, good.
Brad,
Brad, can I make one quick comment?
Sure.
Just in terms of our task as this group, in asking what I think is going to be the hardest to do, our purpose here is to create the governance entity. And I think when I look at environment, activation, and equity, I think the hardest thing to do in the creation of this entity and the task that this group has is actually a combination of activation and equity. Because if we don't develop a governance entity that can touch and utilize and leverage all of the tools needed from an economic standpoint, it won't matter what else we do, because we're not going to be able to have the funding or the mechanisms from a governance entity to activate it. I think the equity and all of the tools necessary there, similarly, the governance entity has to be able to utilize whatever it can, but many of that's still going to remain with the local municipalities. And so we really have to figure out how this governance entity and what its role is in environment, activation, and equity relative to what will happen on a project-by-project basis and the partnerships that the municipalities have with the governance body that we're creating. I think from a consistency standpoint, every one of these, especially equity and environment, are just incredible sensitivities throughout areas of the river that we're talking about. And we're going to be dealing with those every day of this development over the course of 20 years. And so development of this governance body to utilize all the tools that it can in an appropriate manner with the right checks and balances, I think is by far and away the hardest thing for us to figure out, both from, I would say actually primarily from an economic standpoint, because project by project, we're going to be dealing with equity and environment. And so that's not to necessarily minimize them from a, how do you develop the White River in total? But what this task force is being asked to do is to figure out the governance entity. And I think the tools and the mechanisms are a little bit different when we think about it just from that context and what may be the biggest challenge.
That's a good point. I want to quickly go through just what's going on right now with the plan, and then I want to move into talking about governance specifically. So let me put you all back on mute. So what's next? Now, the good news is that the White River is beginning to be baked into the planning and work of dozens of destinations, partners, organizations, all up and down the river. And so every group, every entity listed here is already or starting to do things on the river. Brenda actually got placed on the Hamilton County Comprehensive Planning Commission because they're interested in how the river plays a feature, in the more rural parts of the county. So there's lots of things already going on. Momentum's already building. Now on the ground, this is a better view of that ugly bridge picture that we showed, but this is downtown Noblesville. In downtown Noblesville, recently reconstructed the Logan Street Bridge here and also added additional sidewalk space and also that overlook place along the river. And here in Indianapolis, we have this pretty cool LED lighting under the New York Street Bridge. That was a fairly low investment, but super transformative. And now we're finding that all of our major conventions coming to town want to take pictures of our downtown skyline with their colors on the bridge. So it's pretty cool. And we've actually given the keys to the color box to the neighborhood residents. And so they're the ones that actually get to choose what it looks like. So we're also working in partnership, kind of really led by Hamilton County, and working on branding communication. And so the idea, if the metaphor is national park, how does that actually look like on the ground? If Conner Prairie is Old Faithful, if Newfields is Mud Volcano, and if Southwest Way Park is Mammoth Hot Springs, what is that Yellowstone idea, that package that ties it all together? And how do we, tie all of our attractions and destinations, and everyone has different brand and different mission. How do we figure out how all of those can come together to tell a story? And then Brenda mentioned this a little bit, but the Meadow Reach study, this idea of connecting some parks with the River Education Center at Conner Prairie into this kind of bigger story that involves some pedestrian bridges and invasive species mitigation, restoration, things like that. And so that brings us to governance, and so really why you are here. Now,
Brad,
yes.
I'm sorry, this is Brian Payne. I as we get to the beautiful, very beautiful presentation, I got completely re-energized and inspired by it, so thank you. Unfortunately, I have to go on to a relief fund conversation, so maybe you and I can circle back and you can give me this one-on-one over the phone or on Zoom in the next week or so, but I have to get off this phone and go on a relief fund call. So,
right, understood. We're recording this. Understood. We're recording this, and so you'll be able to watch the rest of it. Thanks,
okay,
Brian.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right, so when we talk about governance, what do we mean? And remember, we're really focused on regional. We're not talking about replacing state governance or local municipalities. It's more about regional governance. And so I found this definition: the governance is how we organize to make decisions to accomplish something. Now that something is a given in this case. That something is the White River Vision Plan. And so that kind of leaves, who gets to decide and how. That's who we're focused in on. And so to do that, we have to understand how the public and stakeholders are continually engaged. And along with that, understand relationships to those stakeholders. We know that regardless of what we come up with, there will still be local parks departments, there'll still be property owners, there'll still be state and federal regulatory entities that coexist. And so this has to work within all of that, that existing framework. We have to have some authority to make decisions. That could be legal, but it could also be financial. It could even be relationship or advocacy based. And we also know that we have lots of things we want to do, and we have to have funding to build and sustain those things. And so conceptually, when we talk about governance, that's what we're talking about. Now, the good news is that we're not starting from scratch. So we had HRNA advisors out of New York City who work on projects like this all over the world. They were partners in our consulting team. They gave us a great starting point as part of the vision plan work. And so the things that they've done, they've identified the types of activities, the qualities or criteria for a regional entity. They've looked at best practices across the nation, as well as what's already enabled by our existing state code. And they've also developed an initial conceptual recommendation. So let me walk you through each piece of those. And so when it comes to activities, the types of things that this entity or this relationship or whatever we come up with, this model has to achieve, there's really 4 buckets of things. And the first is regional scale coordination. And so planning and marketing, advocacy. An example of that is what we just talked about with that regional branding and marketing campaign. We also know that there's implementation support that's going to be needed. So fundraising, helping individual partners like Hamilton County Parks or Newfields get things aligned and off the ground. I'll come back to funding in a minute, but funding might mean anything from a dedicated tax revenue to concessions or even contributions and donations. Now, once things are aligned and funded and approved, we need to get them built. And so this entity perhaps builds parks themselves, or perhaps they simply direct funds to existing local parks departments. They might operate a regional wetland mitigation bank to restore wetlands, or they might operate a fund that supports nearby neighborhoods. And then last but not least, we have to take care of what we built, maintaining it and programming it. And so we've talked about the regional flood system, so perhaps that gets built, and this entity would have to run that. Or perhaps it simply supports existing programming work of local arts organizations to activate the parks and the places that we have or that we've built. Whatever regional governance model system we come up with has to somehow accomplish all of these different things. Now, about funding, we're not asking you to figure out the details about how we fund specific projects or anything like that. But you do need to be aware of both the types of funding that are available in this world, as well as kind of the scale of funding that we're talking about, because that probably informs what types of entities or powers or structures we might need. And so this is just a graph of the different types of funding pots, but obviously when you're talking about taxes, only public entities have the ability to do those. And then there's what planners call value capture, and that's when we make improvements, someone benefits from those, and there are ways to capture that either through voluntary assessments in the case of what they call BID here in the slide, but in Indiana it's an economic improvement district, which is a voluntary tax for a district. There's tax increment financing where you capture a portion of the growth in property taxes. There's also, we can sell property, lease out property for food and beverage or concession operations, which gets into earned income, which is hosting festivals or renting out facilities, things like that. And then you start getting into user fees and then philanthropy and corporate sponsorship. And so that's kind of the spectrum of things that we're looking at. And different types of entities have different, have access to different types of funding. And so that's something to be aware of. Now, it's one thing to know where funding might come from, but it's also kind of the scale piece that is important. So we had the consultants kind of put together kits of parts of different things that might get built and give us kind of a low, medium, and high cost so we could just get our hands around this. And so, for example, a natural trail might cost $250,000. A boardwalk might cost $13 million per mile. And so we've done that for trail systems. We've done that for different types of parks. We've also done that for some other things. And we've also looked at not just the capital expenditure to build it, but also the operating cost kind of per acre to maintain them. And so I showed you some pretty pictures earlier. What do those cost? Ballpark. And so Southwestway Park, where we have that native restoration and those new experiences, that comes in, $8 to $16 million. When you look at, activating more urban spaces in some of our villages, building a more intense community destination like a riverfront park in Noblesville can cost somewhere between 14 and 22 million. And by the time you get to downtown Indianapolis, when you're looking at this includes the full cost to implement an existing Riverside Park master plan, which is 100 million plus of this. But you're looking at retrofitting dams and start addressing some of the water channel and start getting into that world. You're looking at up to $300 million. And so this is not pocket change, and it probably requires all of those types of funding mechanisms that I just mentioned to happen. And so we have to be able to find an entity that taps into all of this. Now you say, that's a lot of money, Brad. To add this up, Marion County Pizza alone is $1 billion. It's also what we spent on Lucas Oil Stadium. And so our communities come together to do things, and arguably a project like this would benefit more than in the stadium. Right, so we've covered activities along with them, the scale of funding that we need to be thinking about to get them done. Next, the plan provides us some criteria to evaluate the appropriateness of the models that we're looking at, the appropriateness of a regional entity. First and foremost, it has to be effective. It has to be able to implement the full mission and deliver on all of the required activities. It has to be flexible. It has to be able to evolve. This, as I mentioned, this is a generational endeavor. Sam noted, this is likely to grow beyond Marion and Hamilton counties. And so we have to think about a structure that's not locked into just our two communities. Next, the economics have to work. And so it has to be able to bring in and spend money from a variety of sources, not only for major capital projects, but also to cover its own overhead and operating expenses. Obviously, it has to be politically possible, and that's more than the obvious big P politics. It also includes being accountable to the public that crafted this vision, while also adding value to the existing partners. The last thing we want to do is diminishing the support and work of the existing parks and nonprofits and things that are already doing things on the river. And finally, it has to be practical. The ideal model doesn't help us if it's virtually impossible to get going. Perhaps the best we can do is get close, or perhaps there's a way that we figure out to be incremental and get something going that we can keep adding to and improving. So right before this meeting, I emailed you a PDF packet that's a work in progress. Andrea Miller was up until at least midnight working on these to get these to you. These are work in progress. We'll continue to refine and add to them. But these are the different models out there that we have identified that we might learn from. None of them are probably plug and play, but they're all things that we can think about and learn from. So I do want to go just super briefly through each of these kind of buckets. There's cooperation models, water management, etc. And I'll also caveat that I'm not an attorney, and so reading state code is not my forte. And so these are our best synopsis of what is out there. And so when it comes to cooperation models, it's kind of our most basic level. There's not a whole lot of teeth to these, but they are governmental entities. They typically don't build or operate a whole lot. They rely on partners to do that. Their real job is to bring people together to have conversations. And so in Los Angeles River, there's a partnership between the various partners in LA to actually implement a plan that multiple people have come together to do. And they really provided a review, an advisory review process. And so before anyone builds a project, it comes to this committee, and they say, yes, it complies with the plan or not. They don't have teeth, but it provides dialogue. And here in Indiana, we have these things called river basin commissions, which are kind of ad hoc created by the state legislature. And they're really focused on flood control, but they don't usually implement it. They just bring people together to plan for it, and then individual municipalities or whatever do implement it. So both of those typically don't have dedicated funding to them. They're just partners bringing what they have to the table. The next group of models are focused primarily on water management. And in Indiana, we have two of those already enabled in state code. They're both primarily, again, focused on building flood control projects. The key difference is that conservancy districts can be created through a process outlined in state code by property owners, while river basin development commissions are created more on a case-by-case basis. Also of note, conservancy districts are also governed by landowners, while commissions are generally governed by existing elected officials. And yes, there is a difference between a river basin commission in Indiana and a river basin development commission in Indiana. The key thing is that development commissions don't just plan for things, they actually develop the infrastructure. The next group of models relate to recreation. And so we've got two from Indiana, one from Ohio. The Wabash River Heritage Corridor was created specifically by the state legislature, and it's focused on preservation of cultural and recreational amenities in multiple counties along the Wabash River. It has a unique funding, sustainable funding from mineral royalties, from mineral rights under the river that the state derives royalties from, and so they repurpose that into a dedicated fund. But most of our money comes from project appropriations directly from the legislature. Now, here in central Indiana, we have the White River State Park Development Commission, which was created by the Indiana legislature. It's actually not part of the DNR state park system. We didn't know that until this process. It's its own entity, its own thing. It's obviously focused on parks, recreation, and meeting facilities. Now, it has the authority in statute to make grants of funds, of lands to anyone in Marion County. And it has the jurisdiction within a mile of the White River on either side throughout Marion County. And so we think of White River State Park as the downtown park, but the commission actually in state statute already could do things up and down the river throughout Marion County. And then in Ohio, there's this idea of a regional park system. And so it's created when multiple counties or jurisdictions come together to create parks and recreation. It is funded by a property tax levy. It also has the ability to have voter-approved referendums and special assessments that it issues. It also has police power authorities. And so think of this as a regional park system that has parks in all of our communities, but doesn't replace Noblesville Parks, it doesn't replace Fisher's Parks or any parks. It's kind of building in addition to those. So it's something between a state park system and a local park system. And you'll notice these Ohio ones have this weird relationship with their judge and their court system, and that's a unique thing of how the court system works over there. Then there are two models for multi-purpose that do a lot more than that. And so Ohio Conservancy districts do all of the things that Indiana Conservancy districts do, so focus on flood control. But they've also added water supply, wastewater management, and more recently, they've authorized them to get into the parks and recreation world. And so they do kind of the full spectrum of things. And that's helpful because when conservancy districts acquire large pieces of land or reservoirs or dry reservoirs or things like that, that land can be used for recreation. And so it's helpful to have both of those under one entity. And then brand new in Indiana, coming out of this legislative session and signed by the governor, is the Central Indiana Regional Development Authority. And this is brand new, has not been implemented yet, but it will be. And basically adjacent communities, counties in central Indiana can come together to focus on regional projects of all sorts. It's very broad legislation that includes transportation, greenways, economic development, and anything that, quote, enhances the region to attract people. The governance in it was not legislated in the statute. Instead, it was kind of punted to a plan that members have to come up with. And so, how representation works among communities and things like that has not been figured out. The final legislation did not have dedicated funding source to it. Initially, the bill as introduced had a food and beverage tax or a income tax increase that each member could pass, with half of the funds going into this regional fund and half being retained locally. And so this is a brand new tool. It's very broad. But that is a tool that's out there. And then finally, we have this partnership model of Boston Harbor Islands Partnership. It's actually created by Act of Congress. It brings together 11 different federal, state, city, and nonprofit partners that really try to coordinate all of their work. There's a national park in there, there's a state park in there, and there's all sorts of other things in there. And so they've come together to have this group that really does the coordinated planning, so each of them can implement their own pieces of that, whether it's operating the park or programming it or fundraising for it together. Now, we don't believe that any one of those models off the shelf fits. And so what the planning team did was first recommend the formation of this team. And so we're step one. And then they conceptually recommended the establishment of a coordinating nonprofit entity initially to help, so right away, to help keep momentum going, followed by an actual regional entity of some sort to provide the authority and funding stability that's needed to carry this thing out. Now, there are existing nonprofits in the region that do pieces of this, and you'll actually be hearing from quite a few of them over the coming meetings, but we don't believe there's one right now that can do it all. There are also regional entities out there that exist, so the state, the Department of Natural Resources, wherever State Park, the NPO. You'll also be hearing from all of those groups over the coming weeks. But right now, this project is beyond the scope of all of their missions. And so this is the plan's initial recommendation. It needs further vetting and research, and that's why you're here. Where we start from may not be where we end up, and that's perfectly okay. So that brings me to why you're here. What is the purpose of this transition team? And so put simply, your job is to digest all of this existing research, the activities we need done, the criteria developed for the effectiveness, the models that we have, and add into that brand new input from expert stakeholders. And so the next 3 meetings will be for those stakeholders. I won't be talking hardly at all. We will be inviting 10 to 20 stakeholders that represent each of those 3 buckets of environment, activation, and equity to respond through a written brief to a set of questions that we worked with the co-chairs to develop. So there will be people that respond in writing to those. At the meeting, a smaller group of those respondents will be with us in person or virtually if we still have to do that, as a panel of experts for you to ask Q&A to get their thoughts. So our next meeting will be covering environment, followed by economy and activation, and our third meeting, and our fourth meeting will be equity and community. Meetings 5 and 6 are where you digest all of that and answer the question, what is our model? You'll have staff support, we'll tap some experts when we need to get feedback. We will be, between meetings 4 and 5, we'll be meeting with all the mayors and all the State House delegation and people like that to get their input as well, because they're going to have to own and carry this too. And when we say, what is our model? This model has to work for Noblesville and Fishers. It has to work for Indianapolis. It has to work for the region. It has to work for the state of Indiana. So as Aaron and Tom and Brenda noted, this is the hard part. It's got to work for all levels. And that's kind of a wicked problem that we haven't, I don't think, successfully wrestled to the ground here in our region. And so that's my end. That's me, the end of me talking about what the White River Vision Plan is, as well as what governance means, what we need out of it, and kind of what the charge is to this committee. And so with that, we've still got some time, about 10 minutes left for Q&A and further discussions.
I have a comment.
Yes, Julie.
So this is interesting to me because when I did my project in 2008, I met everybody along the river who was going to be from 96th Street all the way up past Noblesville. And what I started seeing, and here we are today, and I just wanted to bring this up, is, and we can handle it differently, but people were being affected by the recession. I mean, I was so excited about this idea of using the river in this super community way, and I met all the parks departments, I met the quarry people, I met superintendents, and everybody was like super spooked about the recession, and I literally could not get any traction because what was going on in the wider culture, in the economy. And here we are, 2020, all these years later, and I think people are ready for this idea, but now we're in, a pandemic. So it's interesting to see here we're at this place again where all these fears come up, and how we deal with that in this big project, because it seems like it lasted for a really long time. The 2008 effect. I just couldn't get any traction literally for years on this idea after 2008. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and I think we will face that, and anyone else can chime in here. I think one thing that's driving, the plan and the vision's done. That was done before the pandemic and inevitable recession. We're focused on the governance piece. We have some sympathetic ears in the State House right now from both of our counties that are interested in moving this forward. And next State House session is a budget session. So that's when you make big moves, right? And so what we're really trying to do is get through this hard governance conversation right now, so we can hit the ground running. We can be ready to go. We can have a governance model, ready to go, whatever it is. We can have a branding package ready to go, whatever that looks like, and so we can hit the ground running. I mean, hopefully things do pick up. We can't predict the future, but everything I've heard about this recession projection is it will be very acute, but not very long. And so we can hope that that's true, and be ready for the lift when it starts happening.
Brad, this is Emily. One request as we think about these meetings going forward is just to have an ongoing conversation about funding, because it on one hand, this seems a little bit to be of a top-down approach in terms of how we're coming up with the governance model. But I think based on what the funding options are, there's a bottoms-up way to be looking at this too. And the governance structure won't be successful unless it's appropriately resourced and there's alignment with those resources. And so if we could have that be an ongoing conversation through our meetings, or potentially a meeting that has some time specifically dedicated to it, I think that's going to be a really critical piece to putting together a structure that is ultimately well-resourced from a financial, but then also a human capital perspective to be able to implement the vision.
Very good point. We'll work on that.
Emily, the reason why I chimed in earlier is because the mechanisms to fund this are so vast, from whether bonding, fees and parks, charitable contributions, that the actual type of legal entity matters so significantly. And you're in the middle of it with 16 Tech, so you get it. But I completely agree. It's not just the funding of the activity, it's the funding of the body itself to be able to maintain management. So, use fees, whatever that looks like, it needs to be an evergreen way to fund something like this.
Any other questions or comments?
This is Aaron.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Yes, Aaron.
Aaron Smith. I'll just echo what was just said. I'm obviously a new one to the conversation. I was just started on Noblesville's council in January, but from what I have seen, even just in my small little pocket of Noblesville, is that people aren't necessarily against change. They just want to, at least in my area, they want their hand held a little bit throughout it. And so I think that even just the documents that I've seen so far with the plan, and even just what you guys have sent over, this green packet, is just a wealth of information. And I think that if we're able to bring these stakeholders along, it goes a long way. So I'm grateful that there's so much thought and time being put into this by you guys, even just for us to digest the information. So I appreciate it, and I'm excited. I think this is good stuff.
Brad, Sam, just thinking about governance structure again, the comments. If we think about this 58-mile stretch as a community asset, can the governance structure look similar to the way that we manage physical assets? Like the Capital Improvements Board and how it manages those physical assets, and hopefully the benefit of the community, and then the representation is broad across the community, and it also, because of that, we trust it and give it access to our capital. And the airport might be another example of a physical asset that is managed in a broader community's best interest, and we give it access to revenues because we trust it and expect it to do good things over the long haul. I don't know if those examples are relevant or not.
No, those are. And the Capital Improvement Board actually, its authority is a lot bigger than what we use it for, which is to build and operate our stadiums and convention center. But that is something that, we'll dig into. Now, the Regional Development Authority language that just passed, that is incredibly broad language, and that it's much bigger than the White River, but it could be that thing for the White River. Now, I will say in every model that we've outlined, I have concerns about governance because it's usually primarily focused on elected officials, county officials, things like that. There's not a lot of citizen resident sort of engagement or its appointments. And so that's something that I think we want to, as we talk about, who votes, who makes the decisions, that's something I really want to have us focusing on. Yeah, they're good points. The Airport Authority and the CID will dig into those. And I know there's a couple others that we've got our radar on that we'll provide. So that packet that we sent out, like I said, that's a work in progress. We'll continue to refine and add to that.
And Brad, I think that the mention of the Miami Conservancy River, the district in Ohio, and more specifically on that, that started as a flood protection memorandum of understanding between multiple jurisdictions as a response to flood mitigation, where it got general obligation support from multiple jurisdictions. It morphed from there into a larger entity, and they in fact are currently looking at a different mechanism that brings additional funding. So it's a myriad of funding patterns and governance models that it intersects with, and I think that'll be one of the things we take a look at more closely as well.
Good. All right, so we're up against our 90-minute timeline. I want to be sensitive to your schedules. Our next meeting is about are those environmental stakeholders. For those of you who have not sent your calendar information to me, please do so today. I would like to get that booked so we can do our best to accommodate everyone's schedule as possible. Because of the timeline of getting those invitations to our stakeholders to submit written briefs and invited to our meeting and have those returned to you in time to digest before the meeting, the next meeting will at least be 5 weeks out. Now, I want to also take this time to, we had good attendance today, good participation today, but obviously it's a crazy world out there. There's a lot of things changing by the hour, if not by the minute. We wanted to go ahead and get this meeting done, this baseline meeting done, but we also want to, not be tone deaf to what's going on in your lives and your community's lives. And so, is having a meeting 5 weeks out now, is everyone comfortable with that? Is anyone not? Obviously we'll play it by ear.
This is Matt, and I think it should fit well. A week from now, who knows?
Right.
30 days from now, probably more. And so to schedule it at that time makes perfect sense to me.
Okay. Well, I will move forward. If any of you want to send your calendar information that haven't already sent it, please do so today. And then I will work on calendaring that meeting at least 5 weeks out. And if the world changes by then, we can play it by ear. In the meantime, I will ask that you review the governance model fact sheets that I emailed out today. I know they're not a lot of fun reading, but they're important. And then 2 weeks before the next meeting, we'll send out the written briefs to you from the stakeholders that they've submitted about environment. And so we just ask that you come to the next meeting having read and digested those, because the first hour of that meeting will be back and forth Q&A between team members and those panelists. And with that, any final comments, questions?
Can I just compliment you, Brad? I thought you did a really good job of taking 2,000 pages and putting it into a very concise format. Thank you. I thought you did a great job.
Well, thank you, Brenda, and thank all of you for your time, your leadership, your dedication to help us make this transformative project as possible as we can make it. And I look forward to working with you over the coming months. So have a fantastic stay-at-home afternoon.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being a part.
Thanks, everybody.